like what was your uh introduction to Buddhism, or like how did you find yourself feeling like you wanted to have more of like a Buddhist path in your life?
Right. So I'm from the Canary Islands originally, which is a Latin country. And I also spent time in the US when I was a kid and also spent time in Spain. And I was raised Catholic, but in a very cultural kind of way, right? So not necessarily, I didn't go deep enough into the depth of that path, but I had a sense of being culturally Catholic. And so when I was a teenager, I got interested in other religions and I started looking for other religions, and I read the Bible. So I tried to study my own religion, and that didn't really speak to me. I read the Quran as well. That also didn't speak to me much. And so I started looking further east and reading books about India and Buddhism and other Indian religions and so on. And I remember, like, I don't know, maybe I was 15 or 16, and reading about Buddhism. And the first thing I read was something, bad translation of the Four Noble Truths. And the first one was like, life is suffering. And I was like, wow, this is too negative. I don't want any of these. Life is not suffering. So anyway, that was my first encounter with Buddhism. Was like, no, I don't want this. This is not for me. And then later on, maybe a year and a half or 2 years later, I had the first big falling in love as a teenager, very dramatic, and the first falling out of love, or feeling disappointed. And so when that happened, that phrase came back to mind. I think I must have been maybe just 18, 17, 18. And I thought, like, oh, life is suffering. The Buddha was right. Life is really suffering. Like at that point in my life, that was a big deal. So that was my gate into the Dharma. So after that moment of suffering, of emotional pain, I decided to start exploring more about Buddhism, because that really resonated with me at that point. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Well, I am sorry that you have that heartbreak is involved with especially teenage heartbreak. That can be like some of the most like painful. That's like, full on Hamlet, like, feeling like the whole world's like not even worth it kind of stuff. And so I'm sorry that you had to go through that kind of experience to get where you are. But it did lead to you wanting to kind of seek out some answers to your questions, or to finding a way to approach life that maybe made the experience of it in itself a little bit more manageable. And did you do that through kind of like more texts? Like, did you find yourself kind of going to the library and doing that, or was there kind of like some Sangha community or Sangha activity nearby that kind of like opened a door for you?
Mm. Well, I must say, there was worse suffering coming after that in life. And I'm sure there's still worse to come, but you're better equipped somehow. I think that part of that kind of teenage suffering is not so much the thing itself, but like so new, right? Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I originally started exploring through books, but I think after that encounter, after that point, I decided to look for some kind of real life human interaction, some sense of sangha. And so I was living in Madrid at the time, and I made contact with, as far as I know, as far as I knew, back in the day, there was no Theravada center in Madrid, but I made contact with somebody who was involved in a Theravada group that met from time to time. And that was probably the first time I met a nun. He was a nun who was teaching that evening, and I had a sense of, oh, okay, this is what living tradition might look like. But I continued reading anyway. I mean, I think those days. So this was all. Oh, okay. Hold on. When did I turn 18? I think it was 2003. Yes, I'm 40 this year. So, yeah. So in 2003, there was already the internet was there. So I did spend time looking at books, but also and going to university library, but also time online looking at websites of Buddhist centers and Buddhist teachings. And I was yeah, I was more or less fluent in English by then because I had lived in the US as a kid, and English had been around my whole life. So I could read a lot in English, which was very helpful. Um, And so, yes, that was the first contact. But shortly after, when I was 19, so in 2004, I moved here to the UK, where I've lived since. And so here I continued pursuing, um, yeah, my interest in Buddhism. I took refuge very early on. I think I was still in Madrid with the Tibetan Lama. So then, obviously, Tibetan Buddhism was what was most available around me, both in Spain and here, to be honest. So I did study under a few Tibetan teachers initially in Madrid, very briefly, but then mostly here in the UK for the next 8 years. Hmm.
Wow. And did you find like when you I was just curious because so you had some introduction to someone that was within the Theravada community,
Mm.
and then you also found yourself eventually, but not too long after, taking refuge within a Tibetan a Vajrayāna context or like with a Tibetan Lama. What was it about that relationship that made you want to have that kind of like like refuge taking commitment like with them and within that tradition specifically, or if it does if it didn't necessarily have a direct cause for you, it just kind of somewhat happened. I'm just kind of curious if like there was something that was appealing to you through the way that the Tibetan tradition was presenting itself to you in that time, and why maybe that was where you took that next step.
Mm. Well, that's a good point. I mean, I'm not sure I remember, to be honest, because this is like 22 years ago. However, I never made a significant connection with the Theravada tradition. I mean, I did have some exposure once I moved here as well, because I was involved with the Manchester University Buddhist Society, and we had speakers from every tradition that was present in the northwest of England. So we did have a lot of Theravada monks from the different Theravada countries. I had a better exposure then, but I mean that initial contact is such that was my first connection with the living tradition, if you want. But no, I didn't join that group, or I didn't go very deep into it. I think at that point I was just looking for Buddhism and what Buddhism is around, and I didn't have a very clear idea of the different traditions. Or and so what was appealing about the Tibetan tradition? I mean, I think probably at the time I wouldn't have put it that way, but I think looking back, it was its availability. It was the fact that it was very easy. So whereas this Theravada gathering took place in a private dwelling, somebody's flat, who hosted the nuns, there were Tibetan centers where I was, and there are Tibetan centers in Manchester, and there were a bunch of Tibetan centers in Madrid as well. So it was easier in a way. Um, and I think there were aspects of it that coming from a Catholic background also resonated somehow. I've never had any trouble with ritual. I mean, and then I became a ritual practitioner later in life in the Japanese Buddhist tradition. I'm sure we'll get to that. And whereas some of my peers who are converts and who come from Protestant Christian backgrounds, they like the doctrine very much, but they don't necessarily like to do ritual as much. I do love ritual, and I really enjoy singing and chanting and performing all these things, because I guess at some level there is a kind of my background primed me for that. And I suspect that's what was going on there. I think both the availability and the ritual aspect felt very appealing. Yeah.
I
Mm.
feel like the ritual performance, especially if you're not turned off from the get, or if you're not against it from the beginning, you it can be like a really wonderful visual draw. It can be kind of a community building and a community reinforcing experience where you're there, you're participating, or you're watching, and it can be, especially if you're not used to the tradition that you're observing, it can be it can add like all these levels of curiosity that maybe aren't fully intellectual. They can just be kind of like, well, there's clearly a lot of detail and thought going into a certain motion, and I feel moved by it. I'm curious why, like what's drawing me to that. And so
Mm.
I feel like I can resonate with what having watching, especially within my early Catholic upbringing, that I can resonate with just like that quality that is clearly thought out in the sense of it being formalized and put into the framework of a ritual activity. But at the same time, there is this, I don't know, maybe mysterious element, or maybe it's just like something that's a little like outside of the more conventional ways of that we do things, with
Mm.
less conventional things that are like items and materials used. Um, and then did you find that the taking refuge, I know this was some time ago, but did you find that the taking refuge experience added a healing element to your life at that point, or did it more so give you this sense of like a platform to more or less feel on track and that you can deepen further?
Mm. I'm not sure because it's like I like to say that the past keeps on constantly changing. It's not just the future, and of course, the present we kind of more or less is more intuitive, right? And the future, in the sense that our plans, what I thought today was going to be yesterday, didn't turn out to be that way. And even plans for the future keep on changing, right? So, but the past keeps on changing because our memories keep on changing. I remember, I don't know about healing, but I remember it being a very meaningful occasion. I remember it was in June 2004, I think. And it was Sakadawa, which is the Tibetan the full moon of the 6th month, I think, or the 5th month of the Tibetan calendar, which marks it's the kind of the same as Vesak in East Asian, Southeast Asian Buddhist traditions, in some Theravada traditions, right? So it's the birth, the enlightenment, and the passing of Shakyamuni Buddha. So that date was chosen for this, and I think I was 18 and I had been looking for something since I was 15, 16. So it did feel, I guess, at some level as a kind of um the end of a search, right? I've come to something, and now it's a public occasion, it's a public performance, and I have come to this. I mean, of course, that becomes the beginning. I mean, every ending is a beginning, right? So yeah, that's what I remember from it. I think, I mean, listening to you talking about ritual, which is a subject I'm very interested from an academic perspective as well, and as a ritual practitioner, of course. um, I recall having a tension always in my Buddhist search between I wanted quiet. Some part of me needed quiet, wanted to sit in silence. That was very appealing. And Theravada, as I first encountered it, was very much like that. And I know that's not the whole of the Theravada tradition, of course, but like, yes, it was presented in that way. Whereas the Tibetan was another side of me that really loves ritual, really loves form, really loves expression. And so I guess already from that early days, there was that kind of tension. So one part of me wanted to sit in silence. And in fact, that's what I did for many years. For 6 years of those 8 years of exploring Tibetan Buddhism, I was mostly sitting in silence. And I found a tradition where that was very much encouraged. And so, yes, there was always this tension. And so I guess I've been swinging back and forth from form to emptiness and emptiness to form. Even now, as a Jōdo Shinshū practitioner, though we don't have formally sitting practice, you can have like obviously more minimalistic or more quiet expressions um, of Shinjin, of faith, if you want, and more involved, more ritualistic, more elaborate, more formal as well. So yeah, there's a bit of both, and that's what I recall. And I think in terms of the refuge itself, it felt meaningful. It felt like the end point of something, and also the beginning of something else. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's it's great that you have like some specific dates or time periods in your life where you can notice like this is kind of the end of an era, and then you were kind of beginning a new era, and you had found something. It was like some element of what you were seeking to address that dis-ease, or that
Mhm.
feeling that you were having as a teenager. And then, that began this journey to further explore how this truth can manifest, and how you could find that it might resonate with you more. And yeah, that recognizing that need, whether in hindsight or then, is great, where you have feeling of I know I need silence. I know I need that quiet. And yet too, there's this other element of ritual that is very much not quiet. Depending on depending on how you're looking at that Buddhism or that or where you are within the a sangha and type of tradition. And yes, so at some point you were 8 years or 6 years into your Tibetan practice, and then at what point did you find that? When did Jōdo Shinshū kind of arrive on your map, and when did that
Mm.
start to feel like a tradition that you wanted to more commit yourself to?
So, okay, so years helped me remember. So I was 18 when I took refuge, and I more or less 18 was a very intense age. So I took refuge just before I turned 19, and but it had been a year before when I had that moment of like, oh yeah, life is suffering. I want to get into Buddhism. So I spent a year looking at the options and learning more before I decided to commit. And then, yes, I studied, as I said, under various teachers. I particularly focused on one practice and on one teacher here in the UK. Then already I was here. Um, and he was around 25, 26. So that would have been 2010, 2011. A few things happened. I mean, for various reasons, the practice, well, the practices I was doing, I didn't feel they were working, which is an interesting thing to say. And in retrospect, again, the past keeps on changing. In retrospect, perhaps they were working, but they were not doing what I thought they were supposed to be doing. I was not happy anyway. I was, yeah, more and more unhappy as time went. And it so coincided that I went to Japan for work reasons at that point. And that trip, that was, I believe that was 2011. So I must have been, well, 25, 26. I can't remember what time of the year. Um, it really made an impression on me because, and I ended up visiting places connected to Shinran, being completely unaware of who Shinran was at that point. But I just thought, well, Japanese Buddhism, Zen, right? So let's look at some Zen temples, and I'd be curious about that. And since my practice was primarily silent at that point, as connected to Dzogchen, then I thought, oh well, that's kind of resonates with it some capacity, right? So I visited some temples. I tried to find Zen temples. And I realized there's Shingon. There's a tantric tradition in Japan as well. Oh, this is the same thing I'm practicing, right? So that was interesting. But I mean, one thing that really struck me was the kind of devotion of lay people. Because even though I was never ordained in the Tibetan tradition, my those years were very intense years of practice. It was semi-monastic in a way, and I spent a lot of time on retreat. And all of that I could do while I was a student. I was an undergrad, then a master's, then a PhD student, and I had time. I thought I was busy, but obviously got worse afterwards. And I had a lot of time, and I spent a lot of time doing Buddhist practice every day, but also at home, but also in retreat settings. I took up a lot of time, a lot of a big chunk of my year as well. So and then I went to Japan, and I saw people who seemingly were householders, who probably run businesses, or they worked at an office or something, and they would pop out in the lunch break to go to a temple and just offer incense. But there was something very genuine, very moving about the devotion. And they would invite me as well to offer incense, and they would show me how to do it. Some old ladies as well. And it was like, I didn't feel excluded, though I was obviously a foreigner and an outsider. I couldn't speak the language or anything, but they were like, oh yeah, you make this connection too. And I was very touched by that. I was very moved. And I thought already I was getting to the point of, well, I cannot really do this practice with this intensity moving forward. I mean, once I finish the PhD, I'm starting an academic career. It's a completely different game. And I want to do those things as well. I wanted to pursue a career, and I wanted to travel more as well. And those were things that, yeah, it would have been severely limited if I continued doing that level of involvement. And also, it's an aspect of my personality that I am somewhat annoying. So if I cannot follow this path properly, 100%, like I can't do it, right? So of course, I mean, I could have done less retreat, I could have done less practice, but that didn't appeal to me. So it's like, but I was thinking there must be a way, there must be another way of living Buddhism that doesn't involve long retreats, doesn't involve intensive practice every day, and so on. Yeah, and
And
that's where Joro Shinshū started appearing on the horizon somehow. But I hadn't come to like the actual knowledge of the tradition. I didn't know it existed. It was more a feeling after I came back from Japan. And probably, I mean, I did pop into some Joro Shinshū temples without realizing. Yeah.
wow. And it's so I do appreciate how you say that the past keeps on changing, because there's so many
Mm,
things that are illuminating about some of these elements of your history or your experiences, that it's like, oh, I actually ended up landing in like some Shingon temples, or in some places where Shingon was being practiced, and a lot of those have reverberations to to the practice that you had at that moment. They just weren't within that context exactly. Um, and and then, having had some contact with Jōdo Shinshū there, but not really having it quite register then, but then elsewhere, it began to deepen, or it became that path for you kind of opened up later on. So I do appreciate that phrasing. I think it's a really uh, appropriate way of looking at it, because there's just when you're living it, it can be also confusing. It can be also uh, uh, seemingly chaotic or disordered, and then you look back and you're like, oh, actually, that was a very enriching. Looking back on it, that was actually a very enriching experience, and it led to so much. I didn't realize how much fertile ground I was on when I was doing this, that, and the other thing. And so when you left Japan, you had a important realization, which was that going forward, once you were done with your program, your schooling, and as you more or less were jettisoning yourself into like that academic career, that you needed to have something that was more livable for you, and some less, because you're somebody that wants to do it. You want to do the practice as it's said, or as it's being encouraged or taught, and so you wanted to find like a system that worked best for your life, and that you could accomplish that. Did your introduction to Jōdo Shinshū happen within the Buddhist churches of America, or did that happen in Europe or elsewhere? I'm just curious where you started to become more interactive with Jōdo Shinshū communities.
mm. Yes, so that happened after. So the trip to Japan didn't feel like a big realization. I think I'm attaching stuff that happened later to that, but that was the first point of contact, of course. And I do remember walking past. I forgot about this detail. I think is one of the best stories from that trip to Japan. Walking past Higashi Honganji. So I belong to the Nishi Honganji. I was ordained in the Nishi Honganji. But when you come out of Kyoto Station, you walk past immediately past Higashi Honganji. It's a kind of sister temple that we have a shared history of a number of centuries, and then they became separate, not for any dispute, doctrinal or any sorts, but for political reasons, really. So anyway, like the teaching is still very similar. And so Higashi Honganji had a banner outside that read in English. I couldn't read Japanese at the time. It read in English, "Right now, life is living you." And I thought that was funny because it reminded me, and you'll have to help me with this, but there's a comedy film about a Russian comedian in the US who's constantly turning things around. It says like, in the US, you find a party, but in Soviet Russia, the party finds you.
Yeah,
And things like
Yakov Smirnov. Yeah,
that's right.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that was kind of on my mind. And I thought this is like, oh, this is like, okay, well, it's like a spin-off on that. And it made me laugh. And I thought it was a silly joke in a way. I took a picture of it. But at the same time, I had a feeling there was something deeper to that. Though in English, it sounded funny to me. And the first thing that says a lot about my shallowness. The first thing I could think of was Jakub Smirnov, when I read that phrase. Somehow it stayed with me, right? And so, and I think that's key to understand Joro Shinshū. What Joro Shinshū? How come Joro Shinshū is this more livable, more liberal, if you want, or has this more relaxed approach to practice, even though it can be very strict in other ways. Um, but um, but it allows for so much freedom in terms of how do you live your life. And so it's because you are not doing it. You are not the agent. You're not driving the practice. You're not the doer of the practice. Practice happens, sure, but you're not the one who's doing it. And I think that phrase was pointing at that. So I mean, that was, trip to Japan, and then later that year or the year after, I can't remember exactly, but it became very apparent that I couldn't follow the path I was following. It was becoming overwhelming. There were other issues with authority. I had some issues with the authority of Tibetan teachers. And though I met plenty of very decent and honest and worthwhile teachers in that tradition, I couldn't agree with the fact that they had this kind of absolute power, even if they were not misusing it. I think as a principle, I think that's kind of dangerous. That's how I felt. So there was that aspect. There was the aspect of the practical. How can I live this tradition? It's just very hard. And so at one point it became apparent to me that I couldn't continue, and I left. And not at that point, I did think that I was leaving Buddhism as a whole, because I thought that's what Buddhism was like. Right. So even though I had that experience in Japan, that hadn't really sunk in quite yet. Um, but of course, like I first thought, well, I'm going to do other things with my life. So I've practiced Buddhism for 8 years. It's been good, great, but I have to move on. And I vowed I'll never become ordained. I want to be a lay person. No, well, that came later. Sorry. Like all the things I've promised, I've broken basically, to myself. So I thought I'm leaving Buddhism. That's it. I can't. The trouble was that every time I was walking down the road, I would find myself meditating or reciting mantra, reciting a sutra or something. Every time I had free time, I would be online looking for something Buddhist. And I realized I couldn't, that interest was carrying on. So on one hand, I realized I couldn't carry on like I had been, but also I couldn't give up Buddhism as a whole. There's no chance. My mind was so engaged with it still and kept on going back to it. So then I realized, well, there has to be another way. So I looked at Japan because I had been there. And obviously the most obvious thing for me was Zen, also in terms of availability in the West. And so I went to a Zendo for a short while, maybe like a few months. And I loved the practice, but also by that point, I had various health issues to do with my joints. And I couldn't sit Zazen I could sit Zazen for 20 minutes, but not for 3 hours, even less 10 hours. And because I'm that kind of guy, just like, yeah, you could sit Zazen 10 minutes every day, 20 minutes every day, but no, I want to do the session. I want to do it properly. So that was not going to work. That was not going to work clearly. And so what happened was, so how did I encounter Joro Shinshū more in real life was Reverend Dr. Al Bloom, the late Dr. Bloom. He had a website. So he was in Hawaii. We never met face to face, sadly, but we did have a very intense correspondence. So he did have a website, which I think is still there, called Shin Dharma Net, and there was a self-study course on Jōdo Shinshū. And I had this negative prejudice against Pure Land Buddhism in general. And I understood by then that Jōdo Shinshū was a form of Pure Land Buddhism. And so, like, I don't want to, become Pure Land Buddhist, but I think this is an interesting course, and I'm going to take it and learn more things that hopefully clarify, which way I might go. And halfway through the course, I was in, like reading up the story of Shindan and everything. And then I started realizing some of the places that were mentioned in that course about the life of Shindan and everything were places where I visited in Japan, and where I was impacted by the feeling of the place, or the devotion that people showed, and so on. So then it all started coming together. So I overcome my initial reluctance, and I wrote to Dr. Bloom. And so I said, what do I do now? I love the course. I love this stuff that you're talking about. Like, this is great. I didn't expect this, but and then he was an academic like me, and he said, like, okay, here's a reading list. Get through it. Ask me any questions. And I was like, cool, I can do this. This is what I do. The practice was very simple, was very direct. It's just Namo Amida Butsu, right? And then, like reading for me was fun. I don't think he would have said that to somebody who wasn't academically minded. But so I remember reading the collected works of Shindan and everything, and I had a lot of time at that point. I hadn't started my career just yet, but I had a few sweet months between the ending of my PhD and getting a job. And so I spent a lot of that time reading about Shindan and saying the Nebutsu and writing to Dr. Bloom, and he would reply to me very quickly. And so we corresponded for 5 years, and he was absolutely crucial in my path when I was at that crossroads. So he directed me to other people that then I met in the real world. And so it was on a trip to Japan, meeting people that he had introduced me to, that I discovered there was a community here in the UK. And so the journey continued and so on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. That well, on a couple of levels, there's this. I'm really appreciative of your resource. You had somebody that was allowing you to uh, deepen things, and like it would give you like a book list, and was like kind of offering a course already for you uh, to have that interest more or less uh, fulfilled or deepened or whatever it is. Like there were opportunities there in place for you to inquire, and then that uh, resonated really deeply, and then that person also ended up like allowing that to continue to foster, and then introduce you to people, and then that allowed for a larger network for you to plug into, and further deepen that experience for you, or that curiosity for you. And at the same time, something I wanted to ask briefly is that, like, you before you took that course, it was like Shin Dharma Net, is that right? Is
I
that
think so. Yeah.
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 Before you took that course, you had mentioned that you had some like hesitation around Pure Land Buddhism. And I was just curious, like, what was that what was it that convinced you not just to take that course, but when you were taking it, that Pure Land Buddhism wasn't something that you needed to steer clear of? And in fact, it can something satisfied that hesitation and kind of quelled it and made it something that you can not just stay away from, but actually embrace. So I was just curious, like what came up in that course that helped you untighten from that?
We enter in the realm of the mysterious and the subconscious. So it's very hard to answer that. I was touched by it in the same way that at a very intuitive level, I was touched by what I saw in Japan. It's a feeling. So I can't describe the feeling, um, but I can also try and rationalize it. I can do both. I mean, I think the feeling is one of overwhelming compassion. And I think up to this point, I did firmly believed it was up to me. I had to make it happen. I had to do all these retreats. I had to do all these practices to achieve something. That as I went on, as I deepened into my practice, and that's what I meant, like it wasn't working, but it was working. It was just not working in the way I wanted it to work. As I kept on practicing, I realized that goal, that attainment was further and further away. The more I practiced, the more I realized my self-centeredness, the more I realized how bounded I am, and by my own desires, by my own dislikes, hatreds, things that annoy me, things that I want to ignore, and so on. So the practice was working, was showing me how I truly am. But obviously, I thought I was getting rid of that, right? Rather than deepening into my Bonno. I would say in Japanese Buddhism, Bonno is like this blinding angst, blinding passions, right? And so I was coming from that experience of failure, of a sense I had failed at this practice. And yet I couldn't shake Buddhism off. So I had also failed at that. So it was a double bind that I didn't know how to get out of. And I realized there was like a Shinran shaped hole in my head somehow. That's a kind of the experience of Shinran, that neither priest nor lay, right? He realized he couldn't be a monk, but he also realized he couldn't be a lay person. He couldn't give up Buddhism altogether. So so I think hearing the story of Shinran and what emerges from the story of Shinran is this sense of overwhelming compassion, the compassion he finds in the primal vow, in the teaching of the Nembutsu. This is a teaching that embraces everybody, that doesn't make any demands, that doesn't require you to do any great efforts, to do anything, but it is a teaching that emphasizes that we all embraced as we are, and that transformation indeed happens, but you don't have to make it happen. And no matter how terrible a person you are, or how bounded by your, or burdened by your blinding angst or blinding passions you might be, you are all the more embraced for that. And I think that emotionally really touched me, because I felt, no, I have to get myself out of this mess. From that first moment, 18 years old, oh yeah, life is suffering. Sure, I recognize that. But then the next step is like, oh, now I need to work hard to untangle myself from this, right? I need to do something about it. And I did something for a number of years. And then I didn't feel any less untangled, any more healed. Um, any more untangled, sorry, or any more healed in a deeper sense. So obviously, all of those years of practice did a lot of good, and did show me a lot of things. And so, more than anything, they prepared me to hear that teaching. So I think at an emotional level or intuitive level, that's what was going on. Again, retrospectively, which you cannot trust. Present self is always an unreliable narrator of the past, you could say. Intellectually, though, I think it was I mean, I think my reservations about Pure Land Buddhism is like the ways in which I had encountered it sounded very Christian to me. And then when I studied with Dr. Bloom, I realized, even though he was using, he came from a Christian background. In fact, I think he was a minister. I can't remember the tradition now. I think he was a Methodist minister. But even though he used a very Christian language, I could see through that, and because I had the background in Buddhism now. I had studied Buddhism for a number of years. And I think my journey through the Tibetan tradition, I'm really thankful to those years, because they provided a lot of background. And that background enabled me to take the leap that Shinran takes. Right. So even though it was in a language that sounded Christian, I could see the kind of Buddhist message behind and the logic of it. And I was like, oh, this was possible. That never occurred to me. And of course, it really makes sense from a Buddhist point of view once you've studied Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, the path that Shinran talks about. That at first was like, what? You're not doing like intensive practice? Are you being saved by another? What is going on? And it's like, well, once you understand what those terms mean, it really makes perfect sense from a Mahayana standpoint. And so I think the way he explained it really made a lot of sense to me intellectually as well. So I think I just found myself saying the Nembutsu and immediately went like, oh no, oh, what's going on? Oh no, I didn't want this. But I realized that was exactly the kind of path that I was looking for, was that kind of path. A path where there was a kind of intensity, if you want, of commitment and devotion, but at the same time there was a lot of that wasn't translated into a huge commitment in terms of time, or my joints suffering by sitting in uncomfortable positions and so on. The irony of all of that is that ended up ordained in this tradition, and I'm spending more time now devoted to the Dharma that I did originally, but I'm quite happy about it as well. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for answering that, both like from an emotional place and then the intellectual place, because both of them were like, both of those concerns or those parts of you were answered or addressed completely, it feels like. And I suppose like we're also trying to put words to emotions, and that can be really difficult to help interpret like how we were feeling back then, and how that might have moved us. But at the same time, like what you were saying makes a lot of sense, and I'm just really glad that you had that experience, that you were open enough to it, that the teachers that were involved in that moment for you, Dr. Bloom, and the resources that you were reading, offered you that understanding that led to you just all of a sudden saying the Nembutsu, and then having what seems like a lightness to where that pressure of you do this work, you do the practice, and you need to get all that compassion, and you need to do all those things. That weight, I think, was more or less, it seems like, lifted. And yet, here you are, you're ordained. Dharma matters, concern you quite a bit, and you are busy with it. So it's maybe it's more on your plate than ever before, but there is this uh, a lightness to it that makes it much more manageable, much more livable, which was your concern from the beginning. So I'm just so glad that you have been able to develop that, and had these moments that help shape it. And then yeah, so now you are someone that is ordained. And I remember we had talked earlier about how you are excuse me, you are someone that has uh, a great interest in the ritual elements of things. And as someone that is ordained, um, and you are also someone that's an academic who has studied Jōdo Shinshū communities in Pasadena, California. You have studied in America. You have studied also in South America, in, I believe, Argentina, as well as in Brazil. You have studied Jōdo Shinshū communities there. And then you yourself are somebody who practices within a community or a sangha in Manchester, England, and UK. And I was just curious what your experiences have been like with ritual, and what you've been observing, and what looking at ritual in all these different contexts that you've studied, what that has done for yourself, and what you think is possible within this shape of Buddhism and Jōdo Shinshū.
Mm. That's a very broad question. Quite hard. Um, okay, so I think, I mean, Joro Shinshu is very interesting from the point of view of ritual, right, or ritual performance, because um, the central practice, I mean, for your viewers who might not know, I mean, I think your viewers are probably very familiar with Joro Shinshu because you've interviewed a lot of Joro Shinshu priests, many of them my friends. But I am I am somebody who would say there is a practice in Joro Shinshu. I wouldn't say there's no practice. Some people say that, and that's okay. The other thing about Joro Shinshu priests, I would say we are the most opinionated species within the human. I mean, humans are species, but anyway, subspecies within humans. Extremely opinionated individuals. So, and ritual is something that is deeply emotional for a lot of people, myself included. So there's strong opinions held about ritual. Now, the interesting thing about Shinshu is that because of the nature of our practice, as we were saying, our practice is expressive, I would say. Our practice is not instrumental. So our practice, like the core of the practice, is to just say the name of the Buddha, the Namo Amida Butsu, right? And this Namo Amida Butsu expresses this deep relationship between awakening and samsara, awakening nirvana and samsara, awakening and confusion, right? So the Namo is the self-centered self, if you want, and Amida Butsu is this vast expanse of wisdom and compassion that embraces that self-centered self, right? And so, but we don't, for the most part, most Joro Shinshu people don't say the Nembutsu in a kind of with a concerted effort. It's a kind of spontaneous, natural nembutsu. As you listen to these teachings, as you deepen your appreciation of this path, the nembutsu comes to you in a kind of very natural way, right? And so there are people who say it a lot and say it out loud. There are people who don't, and that's also okay, right? So, but in any case, we don't say the nembutsu in order to. We don't say the Nembutsu in order to calm our minds, or in order to attain a certain state of mind, or in order to even reach awakening. Or the Nembutsu comes to express something that has already happened. It's a post fact kind of event. where the Nembutsu comes because we feel that we are already embraced, that we are already on track towards awakening, in spite of our shortcomings, or precisely because of our shortcomings, right? We are the more embraced, the more we realize our shortcomings. But anyway, all of these things will take us time to explain. But so because of that, is very free, and is very spontaneous, and is very yeah, it's all these things, right? So then, but a lot of Shinshū ritual, I mean, you cannot like put together a ritual tradition just by, it's all a spontaneous expression of this phrase that comes to people when it comes, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. So no, of course, if we're going to do a ritual, we need to have a script, right? And so the tradition developed, without getting too bogged down into this, into fairly standard Japanese Buddhist ways of doing rituals. So like a lot of what we do ritually is sutra chanting. So we chant various sutras, that are various texts that are important to the tradition. And of course, the Nembutsu is uttered at the beginning and at the end of every ritual, right? But it's also like we have preserved some of that spontaneity, chaotic, cacophonous quality, because everybody says it out loud at their own pace, in their own voice, in their own form. So what creates is a kind of beehive effect rather than a kind of nice synchronic ritual performance. So, but that's just like for a few seconds at the beginning and a few seconds at the end. And in between comes something that is very scripted, very mindful, very carefully performed. But that is secondary to that expression of the Nimbus. So any ritual, first of all, it doesn't have any instrumental value. We don't do ritual in order to get any benefits, in order to alter the course of karma or the course of events. No, we don't do it to attain any state of mind. Though obviously, in order to perform it, kind of naturally, you end up being in a very composed, mindful state of mind in order to perform it, right? Or as you perform it, that just happens naturally if you want, but it's not the aim. And it's not done for that purpose. So ritual is expressive. And there's nothing in our canonical writings, so that would be the three Pure Land Sutras and the writings of Shindan and Renyo Shonin and so on, that says about how you should perform these rituals. And even now, you would find like there's many kinds of, as I said, Joro Shinshū priests, very opinionated individuals. You'll find some priests who would say ritual is not important. Ritual is just fireworks. Ritual is not the point. Point is the teaching, so on. Well, there's ritual priests that focus more on ritual, who are ritual practitioners, more like day to day. They would disagree with that. And they would say they would have their own way of expressing it. But at the end of the day, ritual is expressive. And it doesn't matter fundamentally, soteriologically, it doesn't compromise your path if you chant it in this way or that way, or you perform it in this way or that way. Of course, people have strong opinions about what's the proper way of doing it, but they always couch in terms of what expresses that devotion, what expresses that reverence, what expresses that care, that concern. So insofar as the performance is respectful, it expresses some kind of feeling of gratitude, of reverence, of appreciation, then it's kind of seen as okay. But that leaves a lot of variation and allows for a lot of freedom in terms of how people might express their feelings, the religious feelings. And so it's interesting that, I mean, people think that the rituals of our school are very old, and they are in a sense very old, but I mean, in the current form, they are 80 years old. But they are trying to replicate older tunes, older performances. But it's a kind of modern, as tradition often is a modern reinvention of some older tunes, right? And on the musical side of things, there's also bodily performances and so on. But so that the rituals could be changed. And I always like to tell a story. I mean, I'm not going to talk about all the places where I've been because they are different, each of them. And it's very interesting how, Brazilian sensitivity is expressed differently, Argentinian sensitivity, or Californian sensitivity, or European sensitivity. And it differs from Japan, but not in the ways we expect. Japan can often be more modern than some of these places outside Japan. or Japanese Shinshū followers might favor certain expressions that resonate with their emotions, certain tunes, for example, that in Europe wouldn't fly. The people wouldn't like, that's too modern, that's too Christian, we don't like that. We want the pure original Japanese thing, which is something that was reinvented 80 years ago. And some of these tunes that Europeans don't like, they're actually older sometimes. They're 100 years old, 120 years old, but they are modern. The style is more modern. So we're talking about Bukkyo Ongaku, which is a whole genre of Japanese Buddhist music that is a modern genre, but it has a long history. Whereas some of the more formal performances are based on, shomyo performances. They are based on very ancient traditions, but they have been adapted in more recent times. Anyway, I'll tell you a story to illustrate all of this. So one of the texts that we chant very often is the Shōshinge. Shōshinge is a poem written in Kanbun, in classical Chinese by Shinran Shonin, the founding master. And he summarizes his teaching in this poem, right? Which is 120 characters long, if I remember correctly. And so the Shōshinge, there's, a bunch of tunes. You could sing it too. But there's two main ones that we normally use, two main ones. And when you become ordained, you have to learn those two at least. So since I became ordained in 2019, I've been teaching them to people, to lay people as well, and people who potentially at some point might become ordained themselves. And so I've spent a lot of time with a bunch of people doing this kind of training, this kind of practice. So we met in Japan after restrictions were eased, after COVID restrictions were eased in, that was April 2023. And I had like 4 people with me from different parts of Europe. We were gathering. There was a big celebration. And we went 6 a.m. in the morning, went to the central temple to chant the Shōshinge as I had taught them. And they were like, well, come and we can practice it with lots of people. It'll be great. You get this experience. We've been doing it online a lot. It's not the same. So, they all come ready with the books and everything. And then the leader starts chanting the Shōshinge, sure, completely different tune. And they all look at me like, what's going on? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know this tune either. And it's like, what do we do? It's just try and follow, do your best. Everything is impermanent, right? So the rituals change all the time. And that tune was put together for that occasion. So nobody knew it except the people who were performing it. So people just joined the best way they could. Yeah. So that happens, which is a bit of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's uh that I'm sure there was some like tension of just kind of like, well, wait a minute, we've been practicing all along and now here we are. But to know that it was special to even to that very performance itself, right? And it was something that was very unique to it there. Um
Mm.
yeah, there's so much less, there's so many lessons in that. And I do appreciate you kind of going into um how much variety can happen and how much like even just like whether or not there is practice involved and within Jōdo Shinshū or ritual, whether or not it's necessary, even that alone is just something to I'm grateful for you going into because it could be hard for maybe some people that are practicing other Buddhist traditions to kind of approach it in that way or see it in that way. And so thank you for kind of going into that. And then also too, I mean, like you're bringing up how there are these, well, I want the authentic thing, I want the thing that makes what we're doing the most real feeling, the truest one. It was like, well, actually that is just recently redone, that is a relatively recent occurrence. And shedding light on what is what we can reach authentically, what is actually possibly real. And I guess ultimately I'm trying to figure out like maybe what a lesson can be is that it can be practice is going to kind of manifest how it's going to manifest, and like whether you could find the ways in which that it's happening now that it resonate, but also know that there's a lot of flexibility just so long as underneath it all the ritual is performed with the sense that um it's expressing some sort of gratitude, it's expressing some sort of post occurrence that's already happened. And that being more or less the route that you build on. So thank you for offering all of that. And I know I asked like a really big, huge question, but you have such a unique uh I guess direct contact with so many different types of Jōdo Shinshū communities. I don't know how many other people have that kind of experience. So I appreciate you kind of going into it. And then as we kind of come to a close here, I've really appreciated you offering so much, and this has been such a wonderful conversation. I just wanted to ask like just a couple of other questions that are a little bit like a little bit more on the quick end of things, which is like one, if you happen to have like a project that you're working on, or a foundation, or a cause, or even like a book, because I know that you're an author. I don't know if there's
Mm.
anything that's coming up that you'd want to have people know more about, or to help promote in any way. And then also too, if there's any advice that you'd want to give to somebody along that's going along the Buddhist path that you would have heard when you were doing it yourself.
Mm. Yeah. So the first one is easier. Yeah, there's a bunch of things happening. So, well, for those of you who are Spanish speakers, I also teach in Spanish. I have an online sangha, which you can find is jodoshinshu.org. It's very easy. And we meet online mostly because we have people from all over the world. Also, I'm involved with the British Sangha, of course. And yeah, that's harder to find, but I'm sure you can find it if you're interested. It's also something very similar, jodoshinshu.co.uk or something like that. But anyway, yeah. Um, so we do hold online sessions. That's one thing we do. I've finished recently a translation of a book that by Ken Tanaka Sensei, who I believe was also your guest here. So his book Ocean, which is very very popular, I've translated into Spanish, and it's hopefully coming out very soon. So Spanish speakers, watch out for that. There's an academic book I've been working on for a few years with two other scholars who are also both ordained and who are also both scholars, of course, anthropologists of ritual. And yeah, so that's the project that you've mentioned, and we hope that will come out in the next couple of years. It will be called something along the lines of exploring global Shinshu, roots of transformation, ritual. We'll probably argue about the title for a few more months. And but it will be something on ritual, Joro Shinshū ritual. Um, so, yes, as an academic project, we also organizing the European Shin Conference, which is a big gathering of Jōdo Shinshū Buddhists from Europe, of course, but also from Japan and the Americas. And we are hosting it in the UK this year in September 2025. And so, yes, if you're interested in that, there will be more information coming out of jodoshinshu.org. We will have a dedicated website on that, on our Spanish-speaking Sangha, which Jin and Co, which is the name of the Spanish-speaking Sangha, is also involved in the organizing of this event in the UK. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the minute, which is quite a lot. So yeah, things I would like to do, I'd rather not talk about. But yeah, I would like to do way more translation. I really enjoy translation. I think it's a way of going deeper into the texts and really savoring their meaning and really yeah, coming to new understandings of it. I think that's what rereading is a very important exercise, and that's what ritual is doing in a way. You go over a text again and again and again, and its meaning comes out to you in installments, mostly, bit by bit. But yeah, it's rich, it's fresh every time you approach it, if you approach it with a fresh mind. What advice would I have given? Hmm, that's a very good one. What advice would I have given myself a few years ago? I'm reminded. I don't know. This is something I wasn't. Do you know the Swedish songwriter Jose Gonzalez?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe.
It was very big, like maybe 10, 15 years ago, something like that. That's a song called "Cycling Trivialities," and I can't remember the lyrics exactly. I haven't listened to him for a while, And it's something about like in 200 years, who would care about this? You know, basically what I'm saying is like the problems we all experience right now, or the problems you think are big problems, um, probably not going to be. Retrospectively, you're gonna laugh about them, or they're not gonna, you're not gonna even remember them. And I think from a Buddhist standpoint, is that's very important because we forget about the positive side of impermanence. Often when we hear impermanence, it's like, oh, that's something tough, that's something difficult, and it's true, it is. You know, letting go of what we love, letting go of who we love, losing things that we are attached to is hard. Objectively, it's very difficult. The flip side of impermanence is that stuff you hate, it's going to go away as well. So don't worry, just hang on. One thing is guaranteed, things will change. And you probably cannot anticipate how. So that can be distressing sometimes, but it can also bring a lot of hope because, or a lot of relief, because all those situations that you're struggling with right now, they won't stay the same. They won't be the same. So yeah, that's what I would say to myself a few years
Yeah,
ago.
that's wonderful, wonderful to keep in mind. Yeah, I do feel like sometimes I get caught up in the distressing element of impermanence. But yeah, there
Mm.
is this hope of like, well, that thing that offers you a great deal of discomfort, or that thing that annoys you greatly. Well, it can change. It'll change. It'll change, or maybe you'll change to the point where that doesn't bother you. And however it goes, it will go, and that can be that can be a source of hope. And so thank
Mm.
you for offering that other side of the coin that I don't always appreciate.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
well, Enrique, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate you taking the
Thank you.
time, yeah, to talk with me. And so, how exciting the not just the publication projects that are coming up, but you also have that uh, the biannual European Shin Buddhist conference coming up, and the fact that your temple, your sangha, is leading a organizational role in that, and helping put that together this year. I believe in September, you said, is that right?
Yeah, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of September in Oxford. Yeah.
Wow, that's really, really exciting. And so I wish you the best of luck. I know that it sounds enormous. It sounds like a big occasion, and it sounds like a lot of details and things like that to get going. But how special that people from all over the continent will be coming together, and maybe even more so internationally will be coming to collect and to be together for something so important. So I'm grateful to you for offering that with your sangha, but also to I'm just really happy and that you'll be doing it, and that you are also. I wish you the best of luck when it comes to the all the organizational skills coming up for it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed our conversations, both in person and over here. And yeah, it's been a joy. So thank you so much.